often fails to achieve legal permanence for children who are older than age 12 when they enter foster care. The next slide on your screen talks about the number of children who age out of foster care system every year in North Carolina. You'll notice on the graph that it covers the span from 2001 to 2011. But if you'll look, from 2005 on, over 500 North Carolina youth aged out of foster care every year, and at some points it's even as high as 600 youth. This number is not acceptable. When we think about the number of children still aging out of foster care, are we really doing everything that we possibly can and exhausting all of our efforts to help them achieve permanency when we disregard an out-of-state family simply because it might be a little more difficult? And I want to share something with you guys that happened maybe a week or two ago. And honestly, it really should not have come as such a revelation to me, but I guess maybe all the pieces just kind of clicked at the right time. But I had been working on this webinar and thinking about this actual slide, as a matter of fact, and maybe a day or two later, it came to my attention that a former foster youth in a previous county of mine had recently been in the local paper, and she had been arrested and in jail for participating in a pretty significant crime. And I thought to myself, well, there's another one to add to the list. And over the years, I can tick off a number of names, well over a dozen or more, of kids who had been in the foster care system who had shown up in the paper and participated in crimes of one nature or another. But then that's when it clicked. And it wasn't just that these kids had been in foster care at one point or another, but it's that the majority of them had actually aged out of foster care. And this is what was happening with them. They were participating in crimes, they were in jail, and this is what was happening to them. And to me, that's just not acceptable. This is not an acceptable outcome for our youth. It just isn't. And I know when we're deep in the trenches and in the moment of the craziness of this job, sometimes we don't see or we don't think about our actions and how they impact kids down the road. But honestly, we have to. And if you don't see the importance of permanency for your kids, and they don't know that you value permanency for them, then they aren't going to. And there are hundreds and hundreds of families in the United States hoping and trying to adopt our children. Trust me, we read tons of PPAs every day, and they're out there. And we need to be putting in the effort and legwork to make sure our kids do not end up as one of these statistics. So why should we be considering, or why aren't, out-of-state placements being used? And so just a few months ago, we sent out a survey through our listservs at NC Kids to get some feedback on this question. And some of the most common responses were workers were simply uncertain about the process itself. There were a lot of fears about the process in terms of, what happens if a disruption takes place and the child's out of state. The lack of support you might receive from an agency in another state, the Medicaid issues, the paperwork in general, and ultimately workers wanting to maintain sibling contact. And while some of these issues might be valid concerns, we can't let them prevent us from finding children permanency in a timely manner. Now, we recognize that one 90-minute webinar isn't going to be the answer to all of your questions, but we do hope that we'll be able to alleviate some of these fears today, or at least point you in the right direction to get some help. And we want you to know that we know this is a big issue and a big need around the state because we've heard this from you in our work. So this is just the start of the conversation about cross-jurisdictional placement, and we hope you know that we're planning on continuing this conversation throughout the coming year in different venues. So now let's take a look at an example of how being open to considering out-of-state families provides greater opportunities to your children. And we're going to actually take a look at one of our foster youth who's available for adoption, and we're going to take a look at Angel. Okay, and you'll see Angel on your screen here. And Angel is a 17-year-old boy who has mild to moderate needs, and he's been in foster care for several years, but honestly none of his needs are outside the norm of what you would expect for a child who's been in care for the number of years he has. He's not considered violent, he doesn't live in a PRTF, and he's not sexually reactive. Overall, he's a very loving young man, he's shy, and he very much wants and desires to be adopted. This is a young man who is asking to be adopted and desperately wants a family. In fact, he can tell his worker exactly what he would like for his adoptive family to look like. So when we go into the Adopt US Kids website and conduct a match or a search for him, looking for potential families, and we'll put in the search criteria, and if we limit it just to North Carolina families, the results come up, and that's what you're seeing on your screen here. And if you look sort of at the top under Find a Family Results, you'll see that we get 4 families, and it's showing 1 of 4. Thanks, John. So you get 4 families in the whole state of North Carolina that come back as a potential match for Angel. And of those 4 that came back, I can tell you that 1 of the families is actually inactive. They don't have a current PPA with their agency. And another family has actually just recently accepted a placement, so they're not available. They just haven't gone back to the website to make their profile inactive. So in actuality, you only have 2 potential families in the entire state that might be a possible match for Angel. So, what do you think is the likelihood that his best match is going to be one of those 2 families? It probably isn't very likely. But let's take a look now if we widen that search and we include the entire United States in his search. So I'm going to advance to the next screen here. And if you'll look again under Find a Family Results, you'll see that we automatically start with 108 families who are a potential match for Angel. That is a huge difference, starting from 2 to 108 families. The reality is that it is far more likely that the perfect adoptive family for Angel is available somewhere in the United States. But by limiting our options for him to North Carolina, he may miss opportunity to be adopted and achieve permanence. And unfortunately, each day we are getting closer and closer to making Angel one of those statistics. One more youth aging out of foster care with no familial support. We are doing Angel and other children a disservice by not considering those 106 families who are out of the state and potential adoptive families. We all have a responsibility to do better. So thinking about assessing families and vetting agencies. When we sent the survey out, this was one of the concerns that a lot of folks who participated in the survey had, not knowing what kinds of services the child would receive once placed out of state, or that the out-of-state agency would not provide the same level of service that you would. Of course, we all like to believe that nobody can provide the same level and quality of service that we can. However, everybody knows we can't do it all. But what we can do is make good decisions. And thorough assessments of families and agencies are such an important piece to alleviating this concern. When kids are registered with NC Kids, your NC Kids consultant reviews and screens all of the PPAs that we get from interested families. And then once we determine if a family is appropriate or a possible match, all of those PPAs are sent to you to review in a more detailed manner. So what we're going to talk about are a few key things to consider and keep in mind when you're reviewing PPAs and assessing potential families. First and foremost, leave your biases at the door. You're assessing a family to see if they can best meet. Oops. Hold on, I think we might be having. Can everybody hear me? I think my sound might be out. Can someone provide a chat and let me know if I'm being heard? I think there might be a problem. Okay, I think we were having some trouble with the sound. Okay, I think I might be back. Okay, great. Okay, so we're back discussing assessing families. So thanks, John. So first and foremost, we were saying leave your biases at the door. You are assessing a family to see if they can best meet the needs of your child, not whether or not you personally agree with their life choices, their personal beliefs, etc. The only thing that matters here is whether or not the family has the skills and abilities to appropriately and effectively parent your child and provide them with a loving and stable home. You also want to make sure that the family can meet the general needs of your child. For example, if your child has to have their own room for safety reasons, does the family have the space to make that happen? Now, typically that's something that NC Kids would screen for, but unfortunately sometimes that information doesn't always reach us initially. So those are some things that you might want to be looking for. If your child has a specific medical, therapeutic, or educational need, does the family live in an area where they have easy access to these services? You know, they could be a great family in every other way, but I think maybe they have to drive 60 miles to the nearest mental health facility. So those are some things that you may need to consider. Some children have specific medical or therapeutic needs that require extra training or skills. Does the family have the necessary training, or do they have the ability to acquire it? Does your agency require licensure for all families? And keep in mind, if you like certain things about a family, but you think maybe they need additional training in a certain area, or if you would like or need for them to get licensed, you can ask their worker to see if the family can do this. And we've seen some families and agencies be extremely open to this. And if a family won't or can't comply with your request, you know, you can move on at that point. It doesn't hurt to ask. And if you think if a family has potential, you need to ask. Don't pass up the opportunity to get a great family simply by not asking. Now, most PPAs address the family's feelings and beliefs about supporting birth-family connections and important relationships. You want to know if the family has willingness, both emotionally and logistically, to support the connections your child needs to maintain. And if it isn't addressed to your satisfaction in the PPA, ask questions. And remember, maintaining connections doesn't just mean visitation. In this day and age, there are many ways that we can keep kids connected with extended family or other people who are important to them. And Jamie's going to talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. And when we match children and families, we want there to be commonalities between the two. When you're reading the PPA, do things stand out to you about the family that makes you think of your child? Do they share the same interests and hobbies or personality traits? Like, does the potential adoptive father, is he very mechanically inclined? And does your child always love to take apart his toys and put them back together? I mean, are there just similar things? Do they have religious or cultural preferences? Does the family have specific parenting experience that would benefit your child? Those kinds of things. And the most important takeaway is this. No two PPAs are written the same, and some are definitely written better and more detailed than others. And some of you may read a PPA and get this wonderfully clear picture of a family and know right away this is the family. Other PPAs may leave you with a lot of questions. But if the PPA doesn't answer your questions, don't rule a family out if you think they have potential. Take the time to call the family's worker and ask questions. So I want you to think for a minute about the agencies that you work with in North Carolina, or maybe some of the agencies that you've worked with in the past. Personally, when I was working in the county, I know of some agencies that I just loved collaborating with and working with because I knew that the workers were great, I knew they were going to answer my phone calls, return my emails, and I knew that the reports I needed were going to get there on time. I just knew it was going to be a smooth experience. And then there were the others that when you had to work with them, you kind of knew, oh, I don't know if I'm going to get the information I need. I know I'm not going to get a return phone call. It just wasn't going to be that great of an experience. I'm sure we all have had experiences like that working with an agency at some point or another. But you kind of know who the agencies are that you feel real good about and those that you kind of would rather steer clear of. So you're really already doing the work of vetting agencies. What we're talking about here is just expanding your network to include agencies outside of the state of North Carolina. So here's some things to ask or do when you're considering to work with a new agency. You want to find out what type of supportive services are provided to the family and child after placement. Now, some really well-written PPAs that I've seen outline what services are provided. I haven't seen a whole lot like this, but some of them do, and those are great. But if you don't get that, certainly call the agency. You can talk to their director, ask questions, Ask to talk to a family or other agencies who have actually placed children through this agency and find out what kind of experience they've had. Take the time to do your research. Make contact with workers at the agency. See how quickly the family's worker returns your call or email and how willing they are to share information. This may give you valuable insight into the type of service they'll provide once a child is placed. I think sometimes as workers, and I've been guilty of this in the past as well, we sometimes just assume, well, our child has Medicaid here, so they'll have Medicaid when they go to Virginia or somewhere. But that's not necessarily the case. It may not quite be that easy in every state or even Virginia. Social workers should really be proactive in working with your ICPC consultant to explore the Medicaid requirements in the receiving state. And this should be done early on in the process because it varies from state to state. And Charlene and Rebekah are going to address that in more detail later in the presentation. But we're really fortunate with our ICPC staff because they're very experienced, they're very knowledgeable, and they're always willing to help you if you just ask the questions. You're also going to want to know early on if the family's agency requires purchase of service fees, and if so, does your agency provide those? So I think at this point, Nelson, we have a poll question. We don't. We lost it. Okay. That's okay. Yeah, sure can. I forgot what the poll question was.
So we wanted to ask the participants, how much money do you think is potentially available from the state to help pay for services for out-of-state adoptions? Just go ahead and use your chat pod. Do you think there's any available? If so, how much would you guess is available from the state?
Thank you.
I see lots of people typing, so we'll see. Oh, look at that.
Interesting.
It's a well-informed group.
Very good.
All right, Kim, I'll pass it back.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about exactly what purchase of service fees are. Let me advance my slide here while you guys are typing in. So essentially, in an effort to increase the adoption opportunities for some of our children, state funds were made available to assist county DSSs with placement fees charged by specialized out-of-state agencies. And you'll notice on the slide that specific services can be purchased from out-of-state providers. And as many of you noted in the chat pod, the state does provide $1,800 per child towards these fees. The funds are to be utilized for hard-to-place children who meet certain criteria. And we did put together a handout for you. If you didn't download it prior to the webinar, if you would do so afterwards, that would be great. But the handout lets you know what the specific criteria is and how to make your written request for the funds. And there's also a link on the handout to the specic policy on the first page of the NC Kids registration form, so it provides you some great information there. 1820, that there's a section that asks whether or not your agency pays any amount over the state offered $1,800. A lot of times we don't see anything in there. Some counties may not offer anything over it, but some counties may have a set amount. Everyone who is responsible for recruiting families for children should really know how much their county offers, if anything. Your supervisor or maybe your county finance officer. Oh, dang it. I think my sound went out again. Am I here? Okay, I'm back again. At any rate, if you don't know how much your county offers, or if anything, you should check with your supervisor or maybe your county finance officer would be a good place to start to get that information. All right, so at this time I'm going to hand it over to Jamie to talk with you a little bit more about what to do once you have potentially identified a family for your child.
Can I just say something before you go? I want you to have time. I just want to mention to folks, since we lost some time in the webinar, I just want to let people know this webinar is being recorded for folks who may have not come right back on at the same time we started. And also, we are going to go a little bit past 12 today just to make up that time. And so if you do need to leave at 12, we will have that recording available probably within about a week of the webinar. So I just wanted to mention that we will go a little later than scheduled to make up that time, but I know some folks might not be available.
Okay, thanks, Mel. Can everybody hear me? Since we've had some sound issues, just want to make sure. Okay, everybody in the room can. That's a good start. Good morning. My name's Jamie Bazemore. I am the program manager for the Adoption Services team, as Mel stated, and I'm just going to dive into my slides. Okay, so you have selected a family, or you have a number of families you've narrowed down to a short list of your top matches. What would you do at this point? So first, if appropriate, we always want to involve our youth at this point. We can discuss the characteristics of the family with the youth and start sharing information. This is also the perfect time to introduce a new concept that we've recently discovered called the maybe family. We're all so quick to call a prospective adoptive family a forever family. I'm absolutely guilty of it. We talk to our kids about finding them their forever family. But we need to stop and think, are we putting too much pressure on our families and children by referring to them as forever before they've even met or had the opportunity to get to know one another? In reality, at this point in the placement, we're still so early in the process that it's not realistic to expect everyone to make a permanent and unconditional decision to adopt. So, by using the maybe language and referring to a family as a maybe family, it gives the child, the professionals, and the family the truth about the situation and helps to avoid feelings of rejection and abandonment if ultimately that decision is made that maybe this isn't the best placement for this child. By using that maybe language with the family and the child, it's also important to make sure that everyone is on the same page and not using those terms like forever family or even parental monikers such as mom and dad right away. We've provided you with a great handout that was created by Wake County Human Services. Thank you very much, Terrell, who I know is on the webinar and helped share this information with us and provided it to us. Both Jennifer Teska and Terrell Bowen at Wake County were really helpful. But that handout has some more information about the maybe concept and some links to the adoption agency who created the concept and has more information. So I'd highly encourage you to take advantage of that. At this point in the process, you'll also want an opportunity for the agency and the family to come together to discuss the impending placement in more detail. Now, obviously, if the family's out of state, this meeting may not be able to occur face-to-face, and that's okay. So you'll want to be creative with conference calls, Skype, and other forms of communication. And then that way you can decide if after that meeting, everyone agrees to continue to move forward. You want to remember, as Kim stated, that the prospective family's willingness to move forward is not always enough, and that's okay. You should also be continuing to vet the agency and the family. Continue to ask those questions. Can this family meet the child's needs? Do they have access to the resources vital to that child's success? Does this family fit this child? All right, so you've started talking to the child and the family, you've shared lots of information about the child, and you're still thinking that this family would be a good fit. Now it's time to initiate your ICPC process. So you want to start pulling together your ICPC packet for that child and that family. First off, you want to submit the request as early as possible. The reality is that the packet is lengthy and can certainly seem daunting if you haven't done many, but we promise that practice makes perfect, and it does get easier over time. There are some specific situations where your ICPC consultant may be willing to allow you to submit a packet for more than one family at a time. I'm not saying this is a general statement. You would want to have a one-on-one conversation with your ICPC consultant about those very specific circumstances before you did that, but it is something that can be discussed. You'll also want to make sure you're talking with the family and their agency about the ICPC process and what they need to expect. We can't just assume that they know. It's really your responsibility as the child-placing social worker to be proactive and communicate with and facilitate collaboration with all of these different agencies. This is also the perfect time to discuss your expectations around contact with the child and visits before it actually starts happening. And we'll talk a little bit more about beginning contact in just a moment. And lastly, I know Kim talked about this earlier, but I just can't reiterate enough that your ICPC consultant is not just someone who processes your paperwork. They are really your partner in this process, and they should be included and aware of large decisions that are made like any other member of your team. They have an absolute wealth of knowledge, and they are more than willing to assist you in this process. Okay, so beginning contact. What do you think of when I say the words beginning contact? I think it's fair to say that a lot of us would automatically think about having the prospective family come and visit the child. But we may be putting the cart in front of the horse. Contact doesn't automatically mean visits. So here are some tips that we and other agencies have found helpful during this process. First, you'll want to start with written and verbal communication. You can share a life book, a family book, letters, telephone calls, start using Skype. I'll say Skype a lot during this webinar. Initially, you'll want to take things slow and ease into this communication. After taking one or two of these steps, you might be able to stop right there if you or the family can see that this really isn't going to be a good fit for the child. And that'll be prior to making any kind of financial or emotional investment of having the family and the child meet face to face. If all goes well with those initial communications, then you can certainly make contact more frequent, make it more meaningful, and begin talking about establishing that face-to-face contact in those visits. It's also extremely important at this phase for the family to continue to truly understand the needs of the child that they are considering parenting. Again, they're still the maybe family at this point. The best resource to share that information are who? They're the child's current placement provider and treatment team. So you need to start involving the prospective family in all meetings for the child, even if that always has to be via conference call. You can connect them with others in the child's life to share detailed, insightful information about the child and their day-to-day needs. And this is really another great way to make sure that that family has a true understanding of the child and that they have an opportunity to ask the professionals involved any questions they may have. Again, this could be an opportunity for everyone involved to decide the family is not the best fit for your child and avoid getting into situations where everyone's starting to feel rejected, specifically the children that you're serving. Okay, I'm going to jump on my soapbox very quickly. For those of you who know me, I do that occasionally. So we as a state, me included, really need to consider a paradigm shift when we think about face-to-face visits between adoptive families and the children in our care, especially when we're considering these out-of-state families. You know, this was really a light bulb moment for me as we were preparing this webinar. The NC Kids team, I just kept saying over and over again, I need to redo some of the placements that I've done over the past 10 years because it finally clicked to me that when an out-of-state family comes to visit a child for the first time, there's this automatic increased financial and emotional investment in that journey and commitment to the child, and ultimately that could backfire against you. So let's think about that. The family's probably shared with their family and friends that they're going to be traveling out of state and making this huge trip to come and quote-unquote meet their child. They've obviously built the trip up in their minds and attached all of the anticipated emotion of that first meeting to the trip, kind of a TV movie moment of meeting their child. So they're really getting very emotionally invested. They've also spent a considerable amount of money on travel. Maybe they've taken time off work, they're paying for lodging. So this is all going to increase that commitment that they're making to a child before they've even met that child. And while that's wonderful, and we certainly want to see families making those steps and making those commitments to our kids, it could also backfire and be detrimental to the final placement. So what if they've done all that, they come out, they meet the child and team, they haven't had a lot of information, a lot of detailed information about the child ahead of time, and they start to get that gut feeling that maybe this isn't the best fit for their family. How likely is it that they're going to gloss over those feelings? How likely are you, if we're being honest, going to do the same if you know how emotionally and financially invested they are in making this work? And maybe you're feeling some of that pressure as well. The reality is that both you and the family and the child might press forward with an adoptive placement that might not be a good fit. So if we start contact in the ways we discussed during the last slide, you're making the family as truly aware as possible of the child's needs and the reality of parenting that child first before they ever come and meet the child. There are more opportunities for everyone involved to keep things realistic so that everyone feels maybe a little more comfortable just being honest and saying whether or not they truly feel the placement is a good fit before that family even meets the child, which could ultimately decrease your likelihood of disruption later on. Okay, I'll jump back off my soapbox. And you've done all of these things, and you've had all this contact, and everything continues to go well, and you do feel comfortable starting visits, which is perfect, and that's what we want to see. All right, so we want to take that same slow and steady approach to visits that we did with contact. Just because a family's been identified, it doesn't mean now you have to rush to placement. Children and families have to get to know each other before they can make an adoption decision, before they can truly connect to each other and make that commitment. And the only way to truly get to know each other is to spend a significant amount of time together before the placement. Let's be completely honest. 3 visits, all spent at hotels, theme parks, and the mall, are not going to give a true representation of what everyday family life is going to be like for that child or for that family. So the reality is that speed sometimes can be the enemy to successful adoption, and we have to take it slow. You'll want to continue to use maybe language even during these early visits. And that way, the moments where they start to call the family mom and dad would happen naturally over time. It's not a forced forever family situation. You always want to start visits in a child's safe place with familiar people present, and then over time transition to more neutral locations without supervision, and that should all occur through a series of events, or a series of visits, not just the first visit and then the second visit. And we fully recognize that multiple visits is a lot to ask of these out-of-state families, but our experience at NC Kids is they will do some amazing things in order to be matched with these children. In addition, you can be really creative. Ask your community. Use your resources in your community. Some of the suggestions we got on an MRS call last year were to request gift certificates and vouchers from local hotels, restaurants, and activity locations. We've all got that licensed foster family who needs a break, but they want to help in some way. Maybe consider asking them if they could use the empty bedroom to house a visiting family who could stay with them for a night or two so you can cut down on the lodging costs. Really think outside of the box about ways that your community and agency can support these families in achieving placement for these children. Obviously, around visitation, I can't say it enough, you want to keep your ICPC consultant in the loop because there are very strict rules about when a child can actually go to another state to begin visits at the family's home, and Rebekah and Charlene will address that in a moment. This is also a great opportunity to start having conversations at your agency about how a child would travel to an out-of-state placement or visit. Who would travel with them? How long would the social worker stay? Would that be something your agency could manage financially? You don't want to wait to figure out these logistics once you already have a placement. You should be having these conversations now in your agency so that policy and practice can be explored in a hypothetical manner. So the reality is that anyone who's been working in adoptions for any period of time has probably had an experience where a family or other professionals or a child that you're working with will attempt to speed up visits and move towards placement faster than you had already planned. I think anyone who's been doing adoptions for any period of time can talk about multiple experiences of that. And so I wanted to just share a personal story that illustrates how a long transition can really be used in a very difficult adoptive placements to ultimately achieve success. So when I was in one of the local counties, I worked with an extremely difficult to place child who had a lot of ongoing behavioral needs. Of course, she was adorable and sweet as a button, but when she wasn't, she really, really wasn't. So we identified an adoptive placement. We felt good about it. We felt good about the home. She had a number of visits, probably 6 to 8 visits with the family. We thought we had done a good job of transition. And she exhibited some behaviors during those visits, but certainly never to the extent that she was capable of with those really negative behaviors. And so when we went to make the final placement, literally the final placement, I had her in my car with all of her belongings. Driving her to the home, she had a complete meltdown. She got really scared. This was a really big deal. She recognized this was supposed to be her forever family. And so we pull up into the driveway. She has this complete meltdown, and right then and there in the driveway, the family decides that they cannot parent this child, that these behaviors are outside of the norm of what they thought she was going to be exhibiting. No matter how many times we had told them that, actually seeing it, they said, we can't do this. And that same day, we had to pack her up, return her and all of her belongings to her foster family. And it was absolutely devastating to the child. A couple of years later, we identified a second adoptive family, and we recognized that the risks were huge. Her first few visits, her first 6 to 8 visits with that family were also pretty much ideal, and we continued to see honeymoon behavior. So over time, we decided to slow that transition down. And she literally transitioned and had visits over a 9-month period of time. It was long, it was hard, it could be very emotionally complex and difficult at times to manage everyone's feelings during that transition. But the reality is that her adoptive mother got the chance to truly get to know her and see the reality of parenting her. She fully understood what she was committing to and what she could expect as a parent to this child before the child ever moved into her home. And she went in wise-eyed open before moving forward with that final placement. And the reality is that that adoption continues successfully 4 years later, and the child is doing wonderful because that parent got it. She understood who this child was, and she had no preconceived notions about what parenting her was going to be like. So I personally challenge each of you to be the strong voice on a treatment team that makes sure placement doesn't occur before everyone involved really understands the realities of day-to-day life for both the family and the child. And this also extends to these out-of-state placements. Sometimes we still just have to go slow. Okay. Maintaining connections. So this is something that a lot of you had expressed to us when we sent out our survey as one of the main reasons that you weren't open to considering out-of-state placements. And honestly, in this day and age of technology and mobility, it's sounding a bit like an excuse. I mean, the reality is that we have Skype, letter writing, phone calls, families are willing to take regular vacations, send care packages. There are lots of forms of contact that could be really meaningful and valuable ways of maintaining connections. When I was recruiting for a couple of children on NC Kids, I actually had a family who contacted us and said they would move to North Carolina, that they worked remotely, and both parents, if that was going to be a requirement to adopt these children, they felt so strongly, then they would just move and relocate so they could maintain that child's connections. So these families are willing to do what it takes in many ways. Your expectations for maintaining connections should be part of the conversation with those families early on. Lay it out. If they can't make that commitment from the beginning, then move on and assess a different family. And in a perfect world, all our siblings would be placed together and in close proximity to those they have a relationship with. But the reality is, even if kids are placed in state, there's no guarantee that any family is going to preserve those relationships. Kim actually has a great personal experience about this topic. So Kim, would you mind sharing?
Sure. A previous county that I worked in, we had a sibling group in foster care. It was 5 children, and they ended up being freed for adoption. And the youngest child was an infant, and that child actually ended up being adopted by a relative. But the 4 older children needed adoptive placements, and they were adopted 2 together and then the other 2 together. And we wanted to make sure that these kids maintained connections and contact with each other ongoing. And so the agency was very excited because they found 2 families that were located within like 2 miles of each other. I mean, they were literally right down the road from each other. And since the adoption had taken place, to my knowledge, those kids have seen each other 1 time. And this has been 4 or 5 years ago that this took place. So, you can, all you want to all day long say that if a child stays in North Carolina, that means their connections are going to be maintained. But you can't even guarantee it in the same town, let alone the same state. So, yeah, that was pretty disappointing for those kids.
Yeah, I'm sure. So the reality is that we have to recognize that proximity is not going to automatically mean that connections are going to be maintained for our kids. Instead, what we have to do is really focus on building those connections early between the adoptive family and the other parties. So another benefit to slowing down your transition is that you also have time to facilitate and play an active role in establishing those relationships and encouraging that rapport building. So if you've got an out-of-state family who's coming to visit the child regularly, you can have them start to meet the siblings, meet those siblings' parents, the foster families, the community members, whoever it is you want them to maintain a connection with. And you can facilitate them incorporating incorporating each other into their support networks before that placement is even finalized, so that by the time the adoption is complete, you feel strongly that those connections will be maintained, even if it's going to be not involve a daily face-to-face visit, but could involve other opportunities for meaningful contact. Does anyone have any other suggestions who are on the webinar for maintaining connections if your children were going to be placed outside of North Carolina? We'd really love to hear your ideas. So if you want to write in any ideas into the chat box or anything you may be done to successfully maintain those connections in a quote-unquote non-traditional way. Oh, I've got somebody typing. Great, a couple of people typing. I'm not great at vamping, so I apologize for any quietness on the line. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to come back to that. Looks like we've got some people getting ready to share their ideas, but I'm going to move forward, especially for the sake of time. Oh, wait, here's Terrell in Wake County who said plan a joint vacation, get together with siblings who are not placed together. Absolutely. These families are more than willing to travel and set up vacations and make these connections with these kids. Great suggestion, Terrell. Okay, so you've made it to placement, and this is the final time you're going to hear from me. That final transition to placement is, first of all, going to completely depend on your ICPC approval. So don't do anything until your ICPC requirements have been fully met and you have the approval. Also, you want to make sure that all the decisions and the prep work is completed before that child moves. Make sure school registration is done, therapeutic and medical providers are arranged for and set up, and all the paperwork is complete. At NC Kids, we fully recognize that placing a child in a different state is not going to be as simple as driving down the road if you forget to sign a form. So you need to be very intentional and diligent. You may want to talk to your agency about that final move, and if you're able to travel, maybe considering staying for 2 or 3 days so that you can meet with the new therapist, sign any remaining paperwork, go to the school, meet the teachers, and then also be that face-to-face support for both the child and the family. A lot of these kids who have been in care for many years, especially our older kids, sometimes we as their social workers are their main source of support and connection, and they're going to need our support as they make that final transition. We recognize that this is a lot of work. We know that, and we know that the process can be really complex. But the reality is that we should be doing everything possible to find these children an adoptive home, and not only identify that adoptive home, but ensure that it's successful. And we truly believe that if you're organized and strategic in your planning, you really can make it happen, and the payoff is so going to be well worth it. We all owe these children so much, and more than anything, we owe them the ability to achieve permanence for them, even if we have to work harder to make it happen and consider those out-of-state families. We've condensed a lot of the tips and suggestions in this webinar into a one-page handout that's a great little cheat sheet for you. It's available in your file share pod, so I would encourage you to access that as well. One more offer we want to make at NC Kids is that we also recognize that utilizing out-of-state placements successfully is really going to take your agency's support, and you're not going to be able to do this work alone. So if you need assistance in talking with your agency about the importance and benefits of cross-jurisdictional placements, NC Kids can be a support to you, and we're here to help. And also on that cheat sheet is a list of your NC Kids consultants and what counties they're assigned to. So feel free to reach out to them at any time for support as you work through these things. Yep, Mel's going to jump on now.
Thank you. Thanks, Jamie and Kim. So I just want to feed some questions that have come in. Well, first, I just want to say thank you to Joe Allen for, I think y'all may have seen his personal experience of being a foster care worker for almost 10 years and now being on the other side of the desk, as he says, as a adoptive parents from Texas, and the importance of that communication and taking it slow and really full communication and sharing about the child. So thank you so much, Joe, for that. We did have a few questions, a couple about the $1,800 funded, the purchase of service fees. Okay, that's so. If the placement fails, would another $1,800 be available for another placement? I'm looking at Jamie and Kim. Not sure of the answer to that.
So we're actually not 100% sure of the answer to that, but we can easily find it out and then provide that information in the follow-up document.
Great. All right, thank you. So great question. We'll add that to the follow-up. And how about, I think, Kim, you have already answered this, but just in case people didn't see it, is the $1,800 in addition to non-reoccurring fees?
Yes, it's completely separate.
Okay.
The purchase of service is something that you would apply for through the state.
Awesome. Okay, and then we also have one, when people make an inquiry about kids they see on the website and wish to adopt from out of state, what is the level of priority? Not sure if, and also should they go through MAP?
This is Jamie. I'm not quite sure what they're asking about level of priority. We at NC Kids are always going to evaluate them on the exact same level as an in-state family. We certainly say that if you have two equal families and one is here and one is in Alaska, you can certainly take that into account if all of their things are equal. But that overall, we're not going to automatically prioritize North Carolina families over out-of-state families. And then the question about should they go through MAP, that's ultimately going to be your agency's decision. Some states have classes that are comparable to MAP, or the family may have gone through MAP in their home state. So that's going to be part of the conversation you need to have about what you think the family needs in order to be able to effectively parent this child or children.
Great, thank you. And we do have one about ICPC, but I'm going to ask it now, but then Charlene, you can say if this is something you're going to cover. If we have an approved adoptive home study, would the ICPC process be only a request to place a child in the pre-adoptive home? Would the original packet include the family's adoptive home study? I don't know if Charlene or Rebekah, if one of you would like to address that.
This is Charlene, and I think we do talk about this a little bit during our presentation, so we will answer this hopefully once we're presenting the information.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'm going to then pass it to Charlene, and if we'll try to address those questions, but let us know if the specifics don't get answered, we'll try to come back to it. Okay, go ahead, Charlene.
Okay. Well, good morning again. This is Charlene Timmons, one of the 4 ICPC consultants, and we, myself and Rebekah Richmond, will be discussing the ICPC process and hopefully just giving you a little bit of information about what we do and what's expected in terms of getting the ICPC complete and moving forward with the families that you've selected for your child. As most of you probably know, the ICPC is federal law and is required when you're placing a child across state lines. It is uniform law enacted in all 50 states, Washington, D.C., and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Again, there are 4 ICPC consultants in the North Carolina Interstate Compact office, and we do have a listing. If for some reason you don't know, we do have that listing that shows who's assigned to your county or to a specific county. So we'll move on. It's been discussed about visits and placements, and in terms of visits, again, for ICPC purposes, visits are generally short in duration, less than 30 days, and they have a set beginning and end date, as opposed to a placement that is for longer than 30 days, and there's generally been some sort of placement decision made when an actual placement is made. Okay. Oops. And you will see that the ICPC Regulation 9 is what governs and speaks to placement versus visit. We do, I think we had one slide that had, well, not yet, you'll see one slide talks about, gives you an actual drop down that allows you to see all of the regulations, and we do encourage you to take a look at the regulations when you have questions about the visit and or placement that we will talk about a little bit more right now. And again, that drop down is here, but when preparing to submit an ICPC request, there are actually 12 regulations that the ICPC is governed by at the moment, and ICPC Regulation 2 is the regulation that we're required to use when making the public adoption placements and or foster and relative placements. Okay, so again, that area up at the top does give you a full detail of all of the ICPC regulations. Okay. And when making the referral, you should be, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the ICPC checklist that tells you the documents that you're using in terms of making an ICPC request. It's, again, you're using the case manager's statement of interest as well as your cover letter, and the ICPC Form 100A is the actual document that that's required for all ICPC requests. It's the binding contract, more or less, between ourselves and the other state in terms of making a placement. So actually the ICPC request is for an out-of-state adoptive placement. Is quite similar to any other placement that you're making, in that the documents are quite similar. You're doing cover letter, Form 100A, case manager statement of interest, the child's profile, and I think there was a question about the adoptive home study for the family. That is included, and at this point we're actually trying to get a more specific recommendation for that particular child from the other state. Okay.
And Charlene, I just want to reiterate that the that ICPC checklist and the forms start on page 8 of folks' handouts.
Okay. In addition to knowing in the documents that you're going to be including in your packet, we do ask you to check with us being your ICPC consultant, in your situation, so that we know and can share with you whether a particular state has licensure requirements or medical, educational, child care requirements, so that if that state requires licensure in all cases, and or if your child has specific needs and you and I or you and your consultant feel that there is a need for that family to be licensed, then we're able to discuss that on a case-by-case scenario. Also, some of the medical requirements for the other state, as well as, if your child is of child care age, if it's expected that you will pay for that child's subsidy, child care subsidy, or if that's going to be paid by the family. There are some states as well that require tuition for children who are coming from other states to be paid. So again, when you're speaking with your ICPC consultant, we'll be able to talk with you more on a case-by-case basis as to whether or not the state you're looking at would require that type funding. Okay. Well, what did I do? Whoops. Hmm? Okay. Okay. So at this point, Rebekah Richmond, I do it every time, will talk to you a little bit more about the ICPC process, and we will attempt to answer any questions that you have later.
Good morning, everyone. It used to be Nelson. I'll point that out for anybody who's confused. Oh, there. Can you hear me better? So, good morning, everyone. This is Rebekah Richmond. It used to be Nelson. I'll point that out for anybody who's confused along the way. My name did change. And I'll start out, I see a question that was posed about what's the difference between ICPC Regulation 2 and 7. And primarily the difference is when you use Regulation 7, you're asking for an expedited home study, and that will not be used here for the purpose of a public adoption. So those are used, the ICPC Regulation 7 is applicable to parent studies or relative studies, but certainly not for the purpose of foster care or adoption. So our next slide talks about the violation of the compact, and I'll start here because it is important to note that if a child is placed in another state prior to submitting the ICPC packet or prior to obtaining the ICPC approval for placement, it is considered a violation. And we want to point that out because what's important to note here is that if the child is placed prior to either one of those, the packet being submitted or the approval for placement, then we as a sending state would be taking full responsibility for that child in the other state and any services that child would need in the other state. And we need to make our judges aware of what this violation entails, because if they're ordering kids into placement out of state, they should also be aware that their services are probably not going to be available to that child while they're in that adoptive home. And that's very important because without those services, we could ultimately be looking at the receiving state asking for the children to return to North Carolina, and which would be devastating for any child who's made a connection out of state. So moving on to the next slide about processing those requests that come into our office. So you've identified the potential adoptive family out of state and that family may need to be licensed for foster care. And then you're going to go on to submit the ICPC request to our office. And that does need to be in triplicate so that we can turn that around quickly to the other states. So we thank you when you send that in triplicate. Sometimes packets do come back because they're not sent to us in triplicate, and it really, really does save time and gets your request out sooner than later when we get it correct and in triplicate, and we don't have to make copies or return it back to you. So then the ICPC we'll review your request and we'll pass that on to the receiving state. And you're probably wondering why we need to send that on to the receiving state if you already have an adoption home study for the family. And I think this question was asked, and I'll address it here. And the reason why we're going to ask for another adoptive home study is because we're looking for a child-specific home study. Generally, what you have will be a general home study about the family, but we really want to see a child-specific recommendation in the home study. So if for some reason your request cannot go on to the public agency in the receiving state, we will follow up with you individually to consider other resources. Moving on to the next slide about safe and timely home study reports. So once the request is submitted to the receiving state, the federal law does allow that state 60 days to return a report to our office. We call this a preliminary report. It's not the same as a placement decision. This report is going to tell us the status of the family's home study and any reasons for delay in completion and when we can expect to receive a completed home study. And moving on to supervision. So supervision is indicated on the 100A form that you're completing, and it's near the bottom of the form. You do need to check this if you are asking for the receiving state to supervise the child during the placement. You want to make sure that you have identified which agency is going to supervise that child in placement, and it's typically the agency that's completed the home study. So on to the next slide. With regard to supervision, a supervision begins with the receipt of a 100B. So when you send that to us and we send it on to the other state, that's when supervision typically begins. And it will continue until the child reaches the age of majority or is legally emancipated, or until the child is adopted, or if the child no longer resides in that home. If supervision is no longer needed for any one of those above reasons, then we do need a 100B to close the case. So what's important to note here is that supervision begins and ends with the 100B, and if you open a case, you should close the case with the 100B. Otherwise, we're going to continue to send and generate mail to your office and to the receiving state looking for progress reports, and that can be really timely and prevent us from doing new reports and new requests. So I think my last slide here, we're going to talk about, really just summarize what we've talked about. So step 1, DSS, you're going to send us your ICPC request to consider your out-of-state family. You're going to make sure that you've considered the financial, medical, educational, and child care requirements in the receiving state. If you still have questions, please get in touch with us, and we'll be sure to help you in any way that we can with each receiving state's different criteria. And step 2, once your placement is approved by the receiving state, we're going to send you back that 100A with the approval. And we'd like to note here that prior to that approval, you'll want to make sure that you're doing your visits in North Carolina. So, and once you receive the approval from us, then you can start your visits in the family's state, in what we call the receiving state. Step number 3, you're making the placement and you're going to send us the 100B so that we can begin supervision. And then finally, step number 4, when the finalization does occur, or if there's a disruption, unfortunately in your case, then we do want to receive another 100B to close our case. So we can't stress that enough about the 100B. It is an important document for us in our office, and it opens cases for supervision and it closes our case as well. I think that's it for me. So I see there are a number of questions that are coming in, and Charlene and I can address those.
That's great. Thank you so much, Rebekah. So let's see. The first question is, why would a request not be able to go to a public agency in another state? Can you say a little more about that? So I think it was saying sometimes, I think you said, if it can't go to a public agency, then you would be in touch with the individual. Could you say a little bit more about why that might happen?
Sure. Sometimes we receive requests from private agent. A family would have a private agency home study, and that's what we're talking about is that we would then turn and if it's not a child-specific home study from the private agency, we would expect to receive a request from our DSS here and send that on to the receiving state public agency for that child-specific home study. And also because the child is here in our custody, in a public agency's custody, and we want to offer our state the services from a public agency in the other state. When services are needed or requested from a private agency, then that's when you get into contracts and fees for services.
So in other words, the first choice is going to be to go to a public agency to do that child-specific home study
Yes.
to avoid the fee for service. But there might be some cases where the public agency declines that or is not able to do that, and then it would go to a private agency?
I'm sorry, I was reading questions.
Yeah, sorry. So I was just going to say, so is the situation that sometimes if the public agency might decline that request or not be able to accommodate that request, then would it go to a private agency, or it really wouldn't ever go to a private agency?
No, typically a public agency in the receiving state would not decline our request.
Okay. So another question was, if the family has an approved home study through a private agency, can you ask the private agency for placement approval?
Yeah, again, that's kind of what Rebekah touched on, that, you know, you're going to do a contract with that private agency. And a lot of times we see this happening when the child has like therapeutic needs or something that the public agency would not be willing to take on because of behaviors or even medical at times. So you would contract with a private agency in the other state because of the child's therapeutic needs. So certainly, you know.
Okay, thank you. So another question from Deborah Hare, could we place the child and during the 6 months the child is in the home, request the child-specific home study? I see head shaking no. Yeah. Do you want to just say a little bit about that?
This is what I referred to in our violation. This would be a violation because you do need the ICPC approval in order to place a child out of state for any reason.
Okay, thank you. Then we have an example of 4 children in North Carolina from another state, Connecticut in this case. They came into custody. Parents, while here they came into custody, the parents are still in Connecticut. An ICPC was done on relatives in Connecticut for placement, but that state requires payment from us for relatives to adopt. So is that North Carolina's responsibility since the children are from Connecticut?
Unfortunately, it is because we've now taken the children into custody. It is a situation that, again, working with an ICPC consultant, we might be able to get Connecticut to see that, you know, these children were initially Connecticut children, and they might be willing to bear some of the responsibility. But because, again, we have taken the children into custody into North Carolina, they are North Carolina children, and we are responsible for their care.
Okay, thank you. And this was not actually presented as a question, but I just want to clarify. Do children in agency custody have to be in a licensed placement if they're out of state unless the court approves otherwise? Turn your mic on, Kim.
Sorry, Kim's having mic issues, so she passed that one over to me. So no, if a child is in agency custody but is legally free for adoption, then the placement isn't required to be licensed. So that would certainly be an option to consider. If your child's a legal risk placement, there are a lot of judges who will consider putting in place a court order for the child to be in an unlicensed home in a very specific situation. But that's really going to have to do with your county policy and your relationship with the judges. But no, if the child is legally free for adoption, they can be placed in a family that is solely approved for adoptive placement. That family's not going to receive any kind of board payment, which sometimes throws people off, and the family would want to understand that from the get-go, but it's still a possibility.
Okay, and I think that was the comment that someone made, that right, North Carolina will pay those board payments if they are licensed. So there is a cost to not doing that. Okay.